Lovely to be here and to meet you all, and thank you so much for coming. I know there was a lot of choice and you came here. We're very happy that you did that. I know the theme that we're going to be looking at this afternoon is pretty wide. We're really covering an international perspective, and we could take that in a number of different directions. We think that from talking to a few of you in the audience, what sounds most interesting, I think, is to look at what we have learnt from international experience, what international activities are going on that maybe have some bearing on things that you might be doing in the UK. But if that feels as though it's actually not the question that's of most interest, please do, let's widen the debate out in question time afterwards, and let's discuss the transfer of information in a variety of different ways. Does that make sense for starters? Is that all right if we go that way? Can we just get a sort of feel for the people in the room? I've had a chance to catch a few of you, but so are any of you here running charities in the UK, charities, social enterprises in the UK? 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 of you. Excellent, that's great. Any of you public procurers, local authorities, commissioners? No. Nobody from NHS here or any of the other big ones? No. Any other big contractors? Okay. Private companies? Do we have a sort of show of hands for private companies? Yep, a few of you. And roughly how many of you are actually involved in doing business internationally? Most of you. Excellent. Any other NGOs that we haven't covered? Any other kind of category of people that you are not representing? Tom, charity? What would you like to describe as
umbrella organisation?
Umbrella organisation networks. Umbrellas. Lovely. From Northern Ireland. Welcome.
Social Enterprise Network with Positive Region.
Ah, brilliant. Lovely. Excellent. New network in Northern Ireland. Excellent. So we have a fellow, because Mark's going to represent, obviously, Social Enterprise Netherlands. Brilliant. Well, that just gives us a sort of feel. And fantastic panel we have here. I'd like to just very briefly ask both Mark and Caroline. Mark Hillam from Social Enterprise Netherlands and Caroline Ashley from Ashley Consulting, just to say literally a few words about what they're going to talk about, so you get a flavour of where we're going with this. And then we'll each just do a short presentation, but the main purpose will be to have a discussion to open it up and learn what we can from each other. Okay. Caroline, do you want to start with what you're going to cover in?
Sure. So I do a lot of work looking at what social value social enterprises in the developing world are delivering, or how do those that invest in them or fund them understand that. So I thought I would really look at the 6 elements of social value that I come across most commonly in that work and tell you what they are and what I think is wrong with them.
That sounds great. Good. Excellent. Mark.
I was myself a little bit confused, so I thought there's a few things that I can do. One is to tell you a little bit about Netherlands and compare a little bit where Netherlands is compared to UK, which is quite different. And secondly, I have some examples on what we call fair change, or the more international change that go out. We have some good examples, also the struggles. And the third thing is, I think it can be helpful to talk a little bit about what social value now really is, because that's especially in the international arena, I think sometimes a big discussion as to where is value, or where do you destroy value compared to creating value.
Wonderful.
And I could focus in any of these areas, so depending on what the audience
What the audience wants, and I'm sure you'll be homed in at questions, definitely. And I'm going to talk a little bit about the movement called B Corps, B Corporations it stands for, which is a global movement. I'm wanting to just discuss the extent to which this actually looks at value and embeds value into the bottom line of a business, what that does in terms of creating social value, how it helps the agenda for procuring, for buying, for supplying, for working with companies who are committed to this agenda. So I think if it's okay with you, I'm going to start. We'll talk for about 10 minutes, and then we'll pass down to fellow presenters. And I think I'll just take could I take that pad? That's it, lovely. Thanks. I don't really want to do a heavy slide deck presentation, so rather than focus too heavily, there's just some images, some things that are going on in the background to sort of give you a flavour. I think everybody's able to get the presentations afterwards, is that right? Because that might be more useful than focusing too carefully on the script and things. I want to tell you what B Corps are. And B Corps are for-profit organisations. These are businesses that are intentionally trying to make profit. But the issue about them is not so much that they're trying to make profit, they're trying to make profit and do a lot of other things. They want to also really embed social and environmental best practice into everything they do. And that's their vision, their commitment, that's what they're absolutely there for. And they're really an identifier. To be a B Corp is an identification of a commitment to these much broader agendas. So instead of having a business which has just got, one hand tying behind its back and the other one saying, okay, profit, that's all I can do, this is a much more exciting business model, much more interesting businesses to run, because you're suddenly looking at three different outcomes. What's the people, planet, and profit? So it's often called the triple bottom line approach to business. And what we're finding really interesting is that there's a real appetite for this across the world. It's a global movement. There's now 1,600 B Corps across the world. But what's more important than the number is the kind of attitude and appetite we're seeing for these sorts of businesses. There's a desperate need to show how do companies actually identify themselves. So there's got to be some kind of a rigorous process behind this, rather than just say, I'm a B Corp. Well, that's great, but thousands of companies could say that. What's the real kind of thinking behind it? And perhaps we can talk about what our driver is. I love this quote. This is very much about the future generations. So what actually is... can you hear all right? Yep. Can you hear in the background? Are you okay? Yep. Can you hear all right? If you can't hear, do say and I'll speak nearer the microphone. So we're really looking at how do we actually get businesses to do much more of the actual wealth distribution? They're the most powerful instrument of man-made to create wealth, but then what happens with the distribution of it? So the B Corps are really about saying the creation of these businesses in its essence can do far more than just look at making profit. And it can actually change the way we think about the role of businesses. The B Corp family is pretty big now. It's actually, we've got 6 global partners, and we started in the UK in September 2014. And that came about because there was a massive, you saw how much social enterprise charities are working to really create social value, doing incredible things here. But there are, 300,000 organisations working their socks off to create real positive change. And then there's 2.9 million small and medium-sized enterprises who don't seem to necessarily feel part of that agenda for creating positive impact. So rather than continually expect the social enterprise and charity sector to do all the heavy lifting, how about if we get the other 2.9 million businesses to actually come on board and be part of the solution, not the problem? And that's where the real appetite and energy has come from. So we're now seeing a really exciting appetite here in the UK. We're now 74 B Corps here. And that's a really variety of different sectors and sizes, which we'll come on to. You might recognise a few of these businesses globally. Patagonia, very well-known clothes brand. Ben & Jerry's. Ben & Jerry's is a very interesting example of a B Corp which was already committed to social and environmental change, became a B Corp, was then bought up by Unilever, and insisted that it continued with its totally ethical principles. And Unilever now are looking at this. They've got this sort of small entity within their big corporation who are really trying to push their change through to the bigger Unilever subsidiaries. And now we're seeing Unilever playing a really active role in engaging with us in trying to see how multinational public companies can be involved in this. I'll tell you a little bit more about why that's difficult when we just get on to how you become a B Corp. Here are some of the organisations in the UK that are B Corps. We have about 9 or 10 investors. Really interesting. Investors are desperate to look at how can they support businesses that are actually contributing to the solutions they're trying to solve. What is the way that they can identify companies who are part of what their agenda is? That this isn't to say that they won't still invest in charities, social enterprises and others, but when they're actually looking at what identifies them as a business, they want to be identified as a B Corp themselves. So there's B Corp investors who then maybe invest in other forms of impact-based businesses themselves. So we have all sorts of other businesses in here. Food, the sector is quite large. Cook Foods is a B Corp. We have Cotswold Fair, which is a supplier of B Corps. Lily's Kitchen, which is pet food. A variety of different fashion industry is interested in this. Ethical fashion fits very well. And sustainability consultancies. And a huge range of others. There's about 700 organisations in our pipeline at the moment going through the process. So let me tell you what the process is. And this is where we fit more into the details of measuring impact. If you want to become a B Corp, you have to really start with a meeting in your board, and you need to say, Do we really want to see this business do something other than just make profit? Do we really want to make all the changes that we need to do? Do we want to embed this in our constitution? If we do, what have we got to do to then pass the threshold test, which says we are actually sufficiently committed that we're making positive impact? So the first thing you have to do is pass a performance test, and that's online, and we go through 5 different factors, which I'll come on to in just a minute. If you get over a certain threshold of 80 points, then you can go forward to be reviewed and have all your answers and assessed by an independent team of verifiers. So there is really clear kind of checks and balances in this system that first, the performance test threshold is very high, but then on top of that, there's a verification process to ensure that your answers and your documents and your policies and your website and your behaviour and your employee arrangements all support what you're saying. And then if you've got through that phase, you then need to make a change to your articles. And instead of the normal company articles, which don't insist that you take into account people and planet, they just say that a director must give regard to shareholders. What we now insist on as a legal change is you actually have to commit to saying we will now ensure that the company directors will take into account and look to create positive environmental and beneficial impact as part of their duty. And how they would do that is reflected through what they've assessed and what they've said they are going to be doing in their performance assessment. And once they've done that, there's then a further disclosure questionnaire process which checks that what they're actually doing doesn't have a material breach to the principles that they've just answered. So if, for example, you are in the arms industry, it could be you still get through the threshold. It'd be difficult, but it's possible you could still get through our assessment test. You could still be verified as having verified all your answers, but there's a material difficulty with what you're actually doing is somewhat in breach of the intentions of the positive impact. So there's a further kind of element there, and tax issues fit into that one before you wonder where that might sit. And then if you go through all those phases, you then become a B Corp. So it is no mean feat. This is a light, this isn't a sort of frivolous activity you might undertake on a Monday morning. This is taking really substantial change. And we see businesses wanting to do this either from the very beginning. Some of them are trading subsidiaries of charities. Some of them are startup businesses. Some of them are really well-established businesses wanting to change and build this into their structure. Some of them are large public companies. Much harder for them, as you can imagine, to get the shareholder agreement is not easy, but it's possible to do. And we saw Etsy and Natura are examples of public companies who've gone through this whole process and their shareholders are on board with them. So what we're seeing worldwide is a real push to say, businesses, get out of bed, do it well, make sure you actually show how you're committed to this, stay in here for the long term. Investors will follow you because investors are saying they realise that the short-term agenda is just destroying value and creating unsustainable expectations. So there's a real kind of seeming meeting of minds and agendas at this time. And I think that's why we're seeing in the UK B Corps is just literally flying away, and we're delighted to see it. But we need to harness that and work with lots of partners to help make that a reality. The things that we cover, I just wanted to come to, sorry, this didn't add in my other slide. There's one other slide I wanted to include in this, which is the 5 criteria. And these are, when we're looking at B Impact Assessment, which is an online free tool, anyone can go on and use it, we're looking at 5 different criteria. One is, how are you governed? How transparent are you? What's your accountability? Who engages in the decision-making process? How do you find out information about the company? Really difficult with small private companies, often quite hard to get details. Second one is about what's your impact with your employees? How do you recruit for them? How do you train them? How do you treat them? What's your professional development? What's your pay ratio from top to bottom? How do you manage your appraisal system? What's the process for pay on leave? All these different criteria that fit into a sort of bucket of good behaviour as an employer. which of course also affects your productivity. So it's not, it's not disconnected from the profit motive either. How's your impact on the community? What's your physical community or your virtual community? What are you doing to actually engage with them? How does your business help create positive change in your community? Environment, this is perhaps a little bit more kind of standard about how do you look after the planet's resources, what do you do in your office, in your use of energy, how do you actually monitor that, are you improving your positive impact on the planet? And then those are all really about the 4 hows of your business. So if you're looking under the bonnet, what are the 4 things you'd say about how do I run a business, do I run it with a mindset for positive impact? And then the what is about, so is what I do in its very self of existence a benefit to society? So that's really where we fit very overlap well with the social enterprise market. We're saying, do you as a business actually, because you exist, contribute to social impact? And you can be a B Corp with a variety of different ways of getting the score across all those different dimensions. So this is not a kind of only for social enterprises or only for businesses that are making widgets or working in fashion or servicing a sustainability consumer. This is about a really broad church, and the UK, and we have about 14 sectors, but worldwide it's 42 sectors. So it's a very broad church, and I think that's quite fundamental. The important thing is that the assessment is permanently being reviewed. There's no sort of standard answers as to what would make a good business. This is about, right now, this is the best thinking we've got on it, but we're really open to being challenged. We want to work with other people who understand business and say what works. So those are the kind of processes that we have included in our test. We have a whole number of reasons, which I won't go into now, as to why we think you should be a B Corp, but I hope what I'm saying gives you a flavour of the appetite for it and why it's a brand that can actually do more than just identify you as a good business. It actually helps you join a community of people who want to change the way we work with businesses, change the way investors think about things, change the way money moves, and how the systems really account for measuring what matters, not what doesn't matter. And these are some figures that I'll leave in the pack, but just to give you some evidence about why these things have a positive benefit if you employ, one interesting one here, 47% of B Corps are likely to have women on in their workforce and on their boards. The lack of women in a board is estimated to cost $655 billion just in the US and UK and India last year. Interesting figure. I can't defend it, but it's an interesting way of looking at what's the value might be missing by not looking at ways of creating positive impact across your whole agenda. And we see this very much as a real platform. We work very much with the social enterprise movement, the charities, NGOs, trying to find a coalition of the aligned thinking here. Who else wants to try and change the system so that we don't any longer have money chasing short-term profits, short-term unsustainable goals, the drive towards endless dividend payouts, which have a real effect on eating into the business model in the long term. What does this all mean in practice, very briefly? I think this is where we see Sustainable Development Goals as being a really interesting area, which B Corps, because of their business models, they tend to be able to take equity investment, so they can get scale up quite easily. That means they have a real role to play working in a supply chain with other organisations in delivering some of the Sustainable Development Goals, where you need organisations in country, on hand, able to take up the larger contracts and work with partners who can deliver some of the services. So particularly we think Sustainable Development Goal 2 and 6 are particularly interesting, but there are many others as well. We think the financing of the Sustainable Development Goals could be done through B Corps, the B Corp investors. That's a really interesting way of looking at how do we make sure the money and the positive impact are all aligned towards the goals. And I think that was quite, people here probably know much more about them than I do, but I would think that's a large reason why the Millennium Development Goals didn't manage to succeed in all that they wanted to do, is that the finance was not sufficiently closely attached to the intention. Public procurement. There's a wonderful act in Wales. I know we've got a Welsh lady in the corner here, who is actually looking at the well-being of future generations. This is a sort of, it's a really powerful act, this, and it's going to be law, and it's going to be binding, and it's going to sit incredibly well with the Social Value Act, which is going to say when a public procurement is on offer, correct me if I'm wrong, it's going to say you have to consider what's the impact of that on future generations. So businesses that have got this in their thinking and are absolutely committed to that are clearly ones who are going to be go-to businesses, we hope. And then I think social value supply chains. we see that we have one B Corp called Ingeus, who is working with the government, securing contracts with the government to deliver Ministry of Justice programs, and they work with a variety of other charities and social enterprises, St Giles Trust, CRI and others. So they're able to bring the scale that is otherwise difficult to get for prime contractors, but ensure that they keep the chain of impact, positive impact throughout their procurement. Social Stock Exchange is another example of companies that are committed to impact. They're one of the B Corps. We could use them in a way to actually trigger down the ripple effect of impact. So we have some wonderful press coverage. I'll leave you with that. There are different ways of getting up this mountain. We're really keen to work with other people who see that they want to create a change in the system. And we're not working with just one way of doing it, only B Corps, but this is about saying there are different ways that we can try and change the way we use business as a force for good. We want to redefine it. If you're interested in anything else, please go onto our website, come to me, I've got lots of cards, and we can go from there. So that's just a whistle-stop round through B Corps, which is just only one of the answers of what we're going to be talking about today. Caroline, I think you're now going to talk about your experience through Ashley Consulting, which will be perhaps much more practical about different examples of businesses. Thank you very much.
Okay, so Ashley Insight is a mission, it's a consulting organisation with a mission to improve the effective implementation and scaling of business models in the developing world that engage people at the BOP, the base of the pyramid. I won't go into a long digression as to why people say base of pyramid rather than poor people or low-income people, but basically it's because they don't necessarily want to reach the really poor, so they use this slightly fuzzy term, BOP, base of pyramid. Get me off on that tangent and we'll be here all day, so I'm just going to use base of pyramid, BOP. I also run, and Ashley Insight sponsors, the Practitioner Hub for Inclusive Business, which is an online platform all about the implementation of business models that engage the BOP and how it actually works and what the challenges are. So the kind of work that I do is very often working with social enterprises or large companies or challenge funds or impact investors that are trying to understand their impact and how their business model can deliver social impact and how that relates to their strategy and how the challenge fund or the impact investor can best leverage their input, their grant or their investment or their technical support to try and achieve greater value. So this touches on this question in many different ways of, well, what do you measure? What counts as social value? And how do people use that both for managing their work and for the external world to understand value? So given this task, I thought, okay, what do we really look for in the development context? I was trying to think big picture and sort of compare that to the UK social enterprise space. I'm obviously not going to read out everything on this slide, but I think the figures tell you enough that there are huge problems in the developing world, where half the population are living on less than $3 per person per day, and the lack of electricity, cooking, sanitation, clean drinking water. The problems are huge, and therefore government aid and charities just cannot do enough. So there's absolutely no doubt there is a space for business in this, and there's a space particularly for social enterprise, because there's a lot of innovation happening. One area where there's lots of innovation happening is in sanitation. There's quite a few toilet businesses now developing. This is one example from Clean Team Ghana. You may well have heard of Sanergy in Nairobi, who have got a slightly different model, because in many parts of the developing world, there are not toilets. There's just open defecation in areas, and it goes into the water and into the slums and so on. So these are great businesses, but they're really struggling. They are not hitting scale yet. And it's not really about how you design the toilet, although that is fascinating. I've learned an awful lot about how you design a toilet. But the issue is about consumer behaviour and acceptance. That's the real blockage that prevents some of these solutions going to scale to become real solutions. And they haven't reached a scale yet where there's any credible evidence that actually says incidence of childhood diarrhoea goes down, because you need to get to a level of scale to do that. And obviously what you're aiming for is for childhood diarrhoea, which is a killer, to really come down. Here's another very well-known example, D-Light solar lamp. D-Light have now sold millions of solar lamps. They say on their website 56 million people around the world. I assume they've multiplied by 5 to get to that figure. But there are now many companies that are selling solar products or solar home services. So this is the sector that's perhaps reaching biggest scale so far in the South. There was an impact assessment report just published a few weeks ago, Delight with Partners, and it did quantify the number of extra hours of quality lighting that the households have from their product. It was inconclusive on whether this actually led to increased number of hours of kids studying and doing schoolwork, which is one of the reasons people always go to funders and impact investors and say, fund this business because then kids will do better in school and do their homework. Didn't actually prove that. But at least we have some firm data now that, well, it sounds obvious, but people get better quality light for longer, assuming they're shifting from kerosene. I could spend all my time looking at different examples, but I thought, well, what are we actually looking for in terms of value here? And I think usually there are 6 buckets that we tend to look for, either for the business or for the investor or the donor. How many people benefit? How do they benefit? Who are they? Are they poor? Are they women? Is this innovation, this social enterprise, having any influence on the wider sector? Is it or will it go to scale? And, well, what's the return on investment? Whose investment? So I'm just going to briefly touch on those 6 very briefly. Obviously, I can go into more in questions if you want to. How many benefit is the most standard metric. You go on anyone's website and they'll tell you the number of lives touched. It's complete rubbish because there is no consensus on what counts as 1. Do you multiply by 5 for the number of people in the household? Is it touched this year or since the business started? Does the investor claim it from the date of their investment or from the date the business started? And if it's 50,000, so what? If you reach 10,000 people and you're a mango processor and that's new jobs for farmers, you've done really, really well. 10,000 is scale for an agro processor. If it's an app, so you can get information on, when to have your next jab, 10,000 is nothing. So you have to count the number of people, but it just doesn't tell you value. The much more interesting component of value is significance, or the depth of impact. How much do people benefit? But it's incredibly hard. How much value is it to have your own toilet, or a cleaner public toilet, the Clean Team example and the Sanergy example, or a closer public toilet? Sanergy found that people value proximity as well as cleanliness versus the bush. How do you compare that value? I don't think you can quantify it, particularly some of the value is to the community and some is to you. And then can you compare across businesses? This business gave a market for cassava to these farmers, and this business gave this household a solar lantern. How do you compare that value if you're trying to work out where to invest resources? Really hard. And if you do use valuation techniques, and I know there's a real trend now to put things into dollar terms, which is common in our space as well as in this space. Whose currency are you using? Because the lower down the pyramid you go, if you count the money saved or the shadow wage of labour, well, that's lower for a really poor person, so the value will come out lower unless you adjust for the fact that these are really poor people. Which brings me on to my third component, which is who benefits. And this is one of the biggest gaps in standard practice in the developing world. Given we're solving poverty, it's quite astonishing, but we are making progress on this. For a long time, people have said that inclusive business or the private sector or social enterprise cannot reach the real bottom of the pyramid. That's true. The bottom 10 or 20% are destitute. They are not going to be reached through business. But a lot of social businesses or inclusive businesses actually reach around the 50th percentile, I think. But we're beginning to now get data to understand who is reaching the 20 to 50. Those are the people between $1 and $3 per person per day, and which ones are reaching people in the 50th to 80th or 90th percentile. So we're beginning to understand this issue. Moving away from the sort of direct benefits, what's the influence on the whole system? Because everyone's really into innovation, and the whole point of innovation is that it scales not just through the innovator, but through the sector. And indeed, the innovator, including if they're a business, may well fail, but have a tremendous knock-on effect. And certainly for donor money or philanthropic money in this space, that's what really counts to them. Of course, it isn't what counts to the entrepreneur. Tough Stuff was one of the best-known solar lantern businesses, went into liquidation. But the owners of that, actually, it was announced on Monday night that POA Power has just got its first investment from the Global Innovation Fund. innovation again. It happens to be run by the guys that learned an awful lot of lessons through tough stuff. I don't expect Power Power to be making those mistakes. I expect Power Power to have a transformative effect on the wider sector. How do you value that sectoral change? Well, there's a lot of papers being written on that. From the market systems approach, it's difficult. And then why use enterprise to solve social problems? I don't think it's because it's easier. It's because it can scale. The whole problem with subsidy and a charity-run approach is it stops when the money stops. The whole point of an enterprise approach is it is sustainable and scales. So how do you value that at scale, given the evidence is showing us that it takes 10 years to go to scale, and it takes 20 years for the ecosystem to really go to scale? Most valuation or assessments, most monitoring is done way before it's hit scale. So what assumptions do you take for the scale that is or is not going to be achieved? And finally, there's this desire to look at the return on investment. If you could quantify items 1 to 5, and probably the other 5 or 15 that I've left out, could you compare that to your input? Well, it depends whose investment you're looking at. If it's a donor or investor who put a certain 500,000 into it, can you compare that to the impact? Well, you could, but I think actually that's the wrong question, because that wasn't what was so essential in whether this enterprise, the social enterprise, succeeded. It's really the entire investment that should be taken into account. And most donors and impact investors just report 100% of the impact of whatever it is they invested in and don't even go into this difficult space. We do know that social enterprise success in the developing world needs a whole range of support. It needs grant to get through this valley of death. It needs concessional capital. It needs then more commercial capital. So I actually think this question on return on investment is a bit of a red herring for us and is not the one that I would prioritise. So I said I was going to tell you what I thought was wrong with what we do. I mean, it seems like every item I've picked up, I've kind of said, well, it's not very good. We're not doing it brilliantly. We don't have any answers in international development, I don't think. But people are trying. There is progress. The Lean Data Initiative of Acumen is really combining what's useful to the company and what helps you to understand social impact and gives you some material for reporting to others as well. And it includes who benefits, income profiles. I'm seeing more and more research partnerships, businesses partnering with academic institutions and research partners to really do something in depth. I'm amazed how many research partnerships are now developing. One of the biggest issues is transparency. If at least people say what their assumptions are, we multiply by 5 for every household, at least we can then begin to make sense of the data, even if we're still using different assumptions. And there's a few organisations that are really pushing on that. We're beginning to get some benchmarks. I know what I think is scale for an agro-processor and a phone company, and I think there's more people who are getting this sort of, yes, that's good, or no, that isn't good, but it's not quantified in the sector yet. And patience. I think more and more people are really repeating this sort of mantra, it takes a long time, and we're beginning to get a recognition of how long it takes, which I think is really important for anyone who's trying to understand value and interpret it. So I do think as we move beyond the hype, of which there is a lot about social enterprise and impact investment in this space, there is a lot of capital out there to invest in it, but it is going to require better assessment of value. So we're going to have to deal with some of the weaknesses I've talked about and push further on this progress. So that was me, and there's more information both on social businesses and on measuring value on the Practitioner Hub for Inclusive Business.
Wonderful. Thanks very much, Caroline. Do you mind just holding your questions, if you could just jot them down or whatever, until we've heard from Mark, and then we'll have a question and answer afterwards. Mark, take it away.
Yeah, let me do that, and let me do it quickly then, really. Just very briefly, my name is Mark Hillen. My background is I've worked for a long time for Accenture. I come out of the big business world, if you want to call it like that. I'm now founder and director of Social Enterprise Netherlands, which is somewhat comparable to Social Enterprise UK, but I guess much more towards the private sector than here. What we do is we have our 300 members, those are companies, and we help them, but we also lobby. And then the third big thing is we try to get the climate right. That's what we do. What we use, and maybe that's interesting for the UK as well, we use the EU definition for a social enterprise. And if you look around here, a lot of things that are in social enterprise in the UK are more, in our view, public sector. We are more private sector. So we say companies have an impact first philosophy, slightly different than B Corp, I think. Deliver good service, but they are financially self-sufficient. So we think you need 50% of your income out of the market at minimum. And then we have social in means, and that's something that Barroso once said, is the way you conduct your business, you need to be social as well. Well, here's some data. Let me just overskip that, but we are young, we are 3 years old, we have 300 members, 35% of those members have more than 2 million euros of revenue, so it's more an SME kind of concept at this stage in Holland. Where are we and where is the government? Well, nowhere really. If you look at the politics, we have 15 parties in the parliament. The guess is that next government will be made up of 5 parties, so it's quite different than the UK. And what we see is that the middle parties start to get interested. That's it. And there's some municipalities that see in the social service side, in the community enterprise type organizations that are get interested. But that's it. So we are still in a sort of an open way of working. And what we advocate are the things that also at the European level are advocated for social enterprises, a legal entity, maybe not a CIC-like entity. Like B Corp, for example, is a trademark, but in the US also a legal entity, or at least a form of legal entity. Something like that is what we need, I think. Interestingly enough, if you look back, for example, Philips is a very big Dutch company, international company. It's taken its, what we could call societal, its social mission out of its statutes in 1984. And it is interesting to know that because you can see a movement now, also the big CEOs of Unilever and the others saying, well, shareholder value is a dumb idea. Someone is saying it's a dumb idea. But it used to be that way in the 60s and 70s. So we're sort of going back now. What making these differences? Because if you compare Germany and France and the UK, but also lower income levels, I think there's some things that are interesting. One is, of course, the welfare state, the wealth. If you look in Greece, for example, they have a legal entity, but poverty in the outskirts is actually quite high. It's more like a developing country. The role of the government. So, what does government see as its role? We don't have an NHS. We have different things. Things are at an arm's length. But the culture and attitude is very important, I think. And there's a lot of work being done on attitude, which it's often called culture, but I like to call it attitude. And what's the attitude of the people? And for example, Holland and UK look a lot in terms of individualism and collectivism. That's an axis. Now, there are 5 big axes on how you depict culture or attitude, and one is how individualistic are people. Well, the most individualistic people in the world are US, UK, Scandinavian countries, and Holland. And where southern countries and China, these countries are much more collectivistic. And the other one is, for example, power distance. So how important is hierarchy in a society? And then you see that, for example, hierarchy is important in the Anglo-Saxon countries, but in Holland it's very flat. We don't give very much attention to our boss. We don't care about it. And these kind of things are things that are very important. And one interesting example is always, of course, our soft drugs policies. Not that we have coffee shops and we sell soft drugs in the coffee shops. That those are not social enterprises. But what we did, and that's why people don't understand it, we legalized the selling of marijuana. And why did we do that? Well, because we tax VAT on it. And the people working in these coffee shops actually pay income tax. So for the Dutch government, they earn roughly almost $1 billion per year on that. But the backside, you cannot buy, as a coffee shop, marijuana because it's illegal. And the interesting thing, of course, is that this is a Dutch model, and there's a lot of debate about it, but it sort of shows the Dutch attitude of being very pragmatic, especially when it comes to money. Because that's the main thing. There's not a sort of ethical debate about this. And that's where differences are. Now, if you look at the international change, I just want to tell you the story of the shrimp, because I like that story very much. We eat a lot of shrimp in Holland, and what we do with those shrimps, we harvest them in the North Sea, we bring them on shore in The Hague, and then we sprinkle them with stuff, which is not very nice stuff, and we freeze it and we drive it to Morocco. And then in Morocco, we defreeze the shrimps, and then there are some companies in Holland have like 3,000-4,000 Moroccan ladies working there, and they peel the shrimps. And when the shrimps are peeled, they go back into a box. We sprinkle them with not very nice stuff. We freeze them, put them in a car, in the truck, and then we drive them back. And that's why the roads, if you go on vacation to Spain, are so congested. Then in Holland we defreeze it, then we have to wash them 4 times to get the bad stuff out. Then we add some salts and some other stuff, E-numbers, because they don't taste very much. And then they go into the supermarkets. And that's how the shrimp industry in Holland works. And why is this? Well, if you have the minimum wage in Holland for the employer, if you add everything up, it's about 16 euros per hour. And the ladies in Morocco, they do this for about 70 cents per hour. And that's the big difference. And now what you see on the left of this picture is a shrimp peeling machine. Dutch inventors have been working for decades on machines that actually can peel shrimps. It's very difficult. But now I think they found it. And what does this story tell you? And that's why I like to tell the story. Well, the story is, of course, that this doesn't make any sense. This is a human system. It's just, you can call it labor arbitration because it's cheaper to peel in Morocco, but it's very bad for the CO2 and for the planet. And now, if we have now some new shrimp peeling environments, because people who are autistics and have a very low IQ, they really love this work. They love to be outside. They love to go out of their house. They're lonely. They can do nothing really, and they like to be together and peel shrimps. So there's a social part, which is not a financial part, but a social part. But the shrimp peeling machine, of course, is also an icon, because this is the way we treat all of our work. We will destroy jobs all the time. You can see it in the banks, you can see it everywhere we automate. So we'll keep a big challenge on keeping work. If we think work is important for people, besides their pay, then we have a big challenge coming up. Yeah, let me not, one difference between Holland and the UK is that we use 2 different words for social. We have a word called sociaal and a word maatschappelijk, and I translated to societal. So we differ a little bit between the individual level of social, like people having jobs who have have a disadvantage, and the more bigger societal questions behind it. If I hear the story about the lambs in Africa, I always wonder, this is great, because we have Waka Waka in Holland, similar company as the D-Light and all these things. And I believe that this is good for children in Africa because they get more chance to make their homeworks and so on. But what will happen to the battery? And how do we count that? Because the batteries are very poisonous. And is there systems? And are these companies really committed to cleaning up? And that's why I always struggle with monetizing. We can calculate that if we emit CO2, how many people from the Maldives we have to move to another country. You probably need to go to India. Or how much money we spent on raising the dikes in Bangladesh. But the reality is we don't want to raise the dikes in Bangladesh. So in my view, you need to be very careful with the monetization. You need a certain belief behind what you do. And then I think it's very, very important, if you talk about what you call social, is talk about the big picture. And talk about humankind, because of course we need to solve the problems of people now, but in the end, as a race, we need to survive. And if the sea levels really rise about 6 meters, that's a projection of Shell actually, so there's not the left-wingers environmentalists, then we will have about 2 billion people who have really big problems. So we need to not only care about today's social questions, but also about tomorrow.
Fantastic. Gosh, what a place to finish. I think it's very much the story of our generation to work this out while we're here. Otherwise, we won't have much of a future to pass on. Questions? Would anyone like to start kicking off with some questions? You can really pick and choose where you'd like to start this debate at a fairly sort of practical implementation. Yes, please. And would you mind just saying your name for the...
Sean Keller. I work for Business Community. I'm the Business Connector for Greenwich. I read an article recently that suggested actually we can solve a lot of the world's problems with current systems, ways of working we've already developed, especially when it comes to the third world. But the problem is we don't implement them properly. So things like malaria nets, we just dump malaria nets there and say, yeah, get on with it, but we don't actually do the implementation properly. Do you think that's right? Do we have solutions to a lot of these things? But due to especially as you guys, Caroline, around transparency, all that sort of it, but we don't do it because we don't want to tell people, we don't want to lose our intellectual property, we don't want to invest in that because we can't monetize it. Do you think that's a valid view?
You'd like to give?
No, I mean, I think yes, because if you look at today's state of technology, we have enough technology to solve everything. We don't need fossil fuels, really. We don't really need that. So I think our big challenge is why I call social innovation. It's about the human constructs, our democracy, our money system, the way we globalize and all that stuff. But it's not a technical question. Of course, it will help if we get better solar panels. It will help if we get better malaria medicines or preventions, shots and so on. But the technology runs very fast. I think the technology outruns, let's say, the human systems. And but yeah, I think so. Yeah.
Did you want to quickly
Yeah,
answer
I
that?
think there
Yes.
are some solutions that have really saved lots of lives, and the oral rehydration therapy in sachets is the best known. That's saved millions, but as you say, malaria nets haven't because of misuse. But then, are they really solutions? Things that are designed and aren't used by the users in the way the users want to use them aren't solutions. And that's actually why I like social enterprise, because your business goes bust if you don't understand your user. So you have to design it properly. And these toilet businesses, they continue to iterate until they find the right model that will become a real solution.
That's really interesting. Yes, we'll take a couple of questions at once. So
Yeah, I'm following from the point the
And say your
gentleman.
name,
My
please.
name is Valma Jones, and I'm quite interested in your B Corp. How many of those companies are BME companies and are from ethnic minorities?
Yes, BME, yeah.
And do you think if you got more, we talk about some parts of Africa where there's not a fraud because of self-interest, do you think that model can actually change businesses if you got them enrolled into that model?
Good question, good question. Hold on that one, let's take one more question so we run. Yeah, Richard, do you announce your name?
Richard Litchfield at Eastside Prime Timers. My question actually was for you, Caroline. We provide services to charities and social enterprises here to help them measure their value and impact. So maybe there's some crossover with what you're doing. I guess I was so I buy into quite naturally, I guess, the concept that measuring your value is important. I was interested to understand in your world how the funding of that measurement happens. Just by comparison to the UK, so I think what we've found here is that it's disproportionately high for smaller organisations, smaller social enterprises, to try and put in systems to try and demonstrate that value. We've had some funders here, so I don't think if there's anyone from the Cabinet Office here, but some funders like the Cabinet Office and others, and there's a new foundation just setting up some and allocating some funds to try and help those smaller organisations to put in those systems. So I guess just a general question in the international development kind of arena, is this stuff getting funded at the moment? Is it, or is it just a bit, who's doing it?
Interesting question.
Okay, shall I just jump back with an answer on the B Corp model for BME? Really good question. The breakdown, any company that goes through the assessment process has to provide a breakdown of the employees across a range of different factors, ethnicity as well as other factors. And there's no black and white answer. Yes, this company must have a certain amount from this age group, this ethnicity, this. But what it's doing is it's across all the different criteria. It's saying, are you maximising the way your business is looking at creating positive impact? So, it's deliberately not saying there's a benchmark below which you cannot be creating the impact you could, but it's taking a kind of assessment of saying, where are you looking to create change? Have you thought about this? Can you integrate a BME policy into your organisation if you're not actually already doing that? So there will be B Corps without these, and there will be some with.
I wasn't asking about the percentage of employees from that company. I was asking whether the companies you have on there, how many of them are black-owned companies?
This will be part of the same sort of question process. I can't tell you exact numbers, I can find out, but there will be a higher proportion of them than there would be in the non-B Corp world, because by definition this is part of the metrics that we're looking at to create impact. And in terms of driving change, I think I would say across all these indicators, we would love, this is a free tool, this impact assessment, it's quite comprehensive, and we would encourage all businesses, whether they're charities, social enterprises, not interested in going to become a B Corp, they use this to think about how can they create change within their business, but also within their broader activities.
So my question, the second question was, do you feel that I could see that model working? So in terms of that model and looking at how businesses in Nigeria, Uganda can use that model to embrace social equalities, because we know that there's a divide between the rich and the poor. Do you think your organisation can stimulate the opportunity for those businesses to see the value of that model?
Yeah, and I think that is happening. We see interest in various different countries, particularly in Kenya, Ghana and Tanzania, some interest in this model. It's difficult because of the legislative background. It's not very, in some places it's not developed, in others it's not consistent. So we're dealing with quite an uneven playing field, and there's a lot of work to be done to bring that to some degree of, that's the first part of the work, is to actually embed some of this into law, and then it makes it an awful lot easier to say, and to what extent are you going beyond that. But let's pick that up separately if it's of help, because it'd be really interesting to discuss. Any other questions from, I mean, there are lots of interesting things then. Yes, Tom, tell us. Sorry, I'm so sorry. Yes, we missed your apologies, sorry.
So funding measurement is a real challenge. When donors are putting money in, they will allocate an M&E budget, might be up to 10%, certainly 5% of the total programme. That doesn't necessarily all go to the social enterprises or whoever at the end of the challenge fund mechanism. It tends to be people sitting in the middle, spending quite a lot of that. Impact investors' acumen really make sure that their investees are moving to do more to make sure their investees are looking at value. But a lot of impact investors, they want to know the business model delivers impact. They assess that at the beginning, now get on and do your job. So there's a real range there. And amongst the businesses, unless they've got a donor or an investor really demanding it, there isn't a pot of funding for it. Either you get some kind of research partnership, JPAL will come and do an evaluation with you, they'll find the funding for it, and the business doesn't have to. Or you have some kind of tech, your payment is by mobile, or your information is done by mobile, and you actually have a load of data that you can analyse yourself, and you're probably quite tech savvy, and you're probably age 27 and you do it. Or you're not a tech firm, you're processing rice, your machinery is your problem, and you just don't do it. That's kind of how I see it split.
Can I add to that? See, one of the things with this impact measurement problem, your question is, see, the problem is often, in my view, that it's sort of one-off. So if you have these lamps, there are many companies that have these lamps. And whether children actually go do more homework and whether that has value, it should not be sort of a one company or one project thing. So we should work together in sort of a bigger database and benchmark, saying, okay, this is true. And if you leave the batteries out in Africa, this is your cost. And not every single project or company should try to figure out what the exact impact is on certain children, because this should be a certain common general knowledge. And I think sharing a lot of this stuff is very important.
I agree.
And then the costs go down. That's the idea. Yeah, and of course you need to be careful also with standards, because they're sometimes true here and not there, but still, yeah. Yeah. For example, in Amsterdam we had a discussion we have a member who is driving electric taxis. And the air in Amsterdam is comparable to London. It's just very unhealthy, and we can calculate why there's so much cancer and so on and so forth. But these taxis actually are cleaner because they're electric, so they don't emit anything. But if you go 50 kilometers up north, it has no impact because the air is very clean there. So even in standards, you still need to be careful, but there should be much more togetherness in this, where you can say, okay, this is we can replicate this, and that will save cost.
I think there is some work on that agenda. Like OECD are doing some work around this, particularly I think with investment, but it could be more broadly done. So we should follow that. Tom, you had a question.
Yeah, it's just building on the same point really about where investment is required. There's a lot of fuss made about the UK from social enterprise and that other countries can learn from it. And, however, whether that's true or not, we get lots of visitors coming to us and asking how things work in the UK. And very often the conversation we have is that people focus on what's being done now. So So there's a lot of investment now, a lot of emphasis on social finance, social investment. And so people from other countries tend to kind of go away with that view that, well, that's the important thing, that's what we need to do. You know, we need social impact bonds, and we need something like this. And it tends to overlook the kind of investment in the whole ecosystem, in capacity for measurement of impact, in the ladder of support that you described, Caroline, and particularly in terms of the emphasis now. You mentioned Global Innovation Fund. The fact that there are innovation funds like that, but there isn't an equivalent investment in pipeline, in local ventures coming up from the ground that could absorb that capital. So you end up with a lot of the applications coming into that fund being US-based or at least northern-based folk wanting to do good, which is great, but that's not quite, it's not fulfilling the potential. So, I mean, what can we do to really encourage policymakers, particularly, to really invest in a more substantial way, as well as getting the message across to people in other countries that actually the focus we have now on social finance only works because over the last 15, 20 years we've been investing in organisations like Unlimited and others, and lots of other organisations and institutions that together actually make that system work, albeit imperfectly even here.
That's a good question. I don't know if either of you would like to start that one. Yes.
I think actually there's a lot of recognition that the ecosystem is changing and in ecosystem development. I think you should talk to Ross Massoud at DFID, who is looking at exactly this. I spent the last 3 years working on the DFID Impact Programme, which is the closest thing there is to a big society capital, though it's nowhere near, which is trying to build the market for impact investment in low-income Asia and Africa. And investing money through fund managers, fund of funds, but also in market development. And I think that's one example of a player in this space that's saying what's needed in the ecosystem: skills, training, information sharing. IRIS shares metrics that can be used. It doesn't share the actual information, going back to this previous conversation, but metrics. I think there's more and more players trying to build the ecosystem, and India is way ahead of everywhere else. I also think the recent Monitor report that looked at how microfinance had developed as an ecosystem and said, we need to do this now. So from my world, I'm in an awful lot of conversations about ecosystem development, but people just don't quite know how to make their bit of the pie work for that big ecosystem building.
Now, and what at least I don't know how it's in the UK, but what I'm surprised about, if you look at, for example, the world of the universities and science, how little there really is on this field. And Holland, I see university moves very, very slowly, but some of this stuff I think is also something where there should be much more science behind. And I can see, like in Oxford, I see things and so on, but it's all very dispersed and scattered. And so I see all these little things, but there's not a bigger sort of view of, okay, if this is what we call social value, and that's what I think we could indeed link to the SDGs or whatever, now here and build it down. And I think, in Holland at least the universities and so do very little. They have some very nice educational programs because the students like it and so on. But really knowledge building, is I think lagging behind.
Yes.
Liz Allen from the Social Audit Network and the Connectives. Just to tell a story that might be useful. Social Audit Networks recently worked with a new standard called W+, which is trying to value the time and energy that women put into activities within developing countries. And we've been to Nepal and we've been to Indonesia. And in both of those communities where they were using biogas units to convert biomass into gas they took groups of women from the communities, and those women became the enumerators within their locale, if you like. So they developed a skill, they were able to evidence and speak in the language of every day to those women, but then were commissioned by other biogas projects to say, we need some skilled enumerators who understand the community. So it was building on that kind of learning piece, but within those women who've already experienced it. And for me, that was one of the things that attracted me to getting involved with W+, that it was like, okay, this is just a bit more than chocolates and cactus. It was actually building something. Just talking about ecosystems.
Yeah, I mean, lots of fantastic questions. I mean, I think you really raised the whole issue. How does an investor leverage the best possible support, to make their money work for the hardest? And what is that? What are you trying to measure? Exactly as you said. Do we need to reevaluate and think about the perhaps the unintended consequences or the unmeasured impact of things and how we interpret what we're seeing? I think your real challenge to us as a kind of here and now thinker, but actually trying to focus on what on earth we see coming down the road. I mean, I heard a statistic the other day that 80% of businesses that will be in existence in 2030 have not yet even been created. So actually we're, the idea of sort of only thinking of what we're dealing with now, we almost have to sort of kind of forward think and then backfill so that we know exactly what it is we imagine we're looking for, rather than just blindly go into the future without a sort of clear path. So I think your challenge, the shrimp story is an absolute indicator of what's the role of labour, what's the role of people, what are we going to do as a society. So we've got some big challenges as well as measuring what we have produced. I think we might be out of time, aren't we? So unless there were any other burning questions, but thank you so much for being part of this discussion, and great to see you all. Thank you.